Hi, I'm Jake Vossenkemper, Director of Agronomy and Research here at Liqui-Grow.
And I'm Phil Long, Regional Agronomist here with Liqui-Grow. And today we're going to be talking about 20 years, or looking back 20 years, at some of the advancements that's happened in terms of management.
Phil, I'm glad you're leading the presentation ago because I was informed 5 minutes ago I would be in this with you. So I'm glad.
It's going to be great. It's going to be great. I promise. So it seems like a lot of times, especially since we work a lot with seed too, that we talk a lot about the genetic impact. So I am going to start kind of on each category and talk about genetics because in agronomy, everything we do is genetics by environment by management.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to start with that. I'll tell you, and then we'll get into the management part of it. So we've got to start with yield trends if we're going to look at what has changed. So corn yield trends, just looking at the graph here that probably many folks have seen over the years, looking back basically about over 100 years. I have it kind of segmented out into the last 20 years to see that the yield increase went from, and this is obviously national average, so 143 to 183, I believe is the exact number. So you're probably thinking, well, 183, I get a little bit better than that on my own farm. But like I said, this is national averages. So 40 bushel increase over 20 years is still a pretty darn good increase when you're looking at, the yield trends as a whole.
So Phil, in your readings and putting this presentation together, have you ever seen anything where they've looked at the yield gain over years in different yield environments?
I haven't dug too far into it.
If I remember correctly, there was a Kansas State paper published, and they showed that there were higher genetic gains in higher yielding environments. So if I remember right, that means that generally producers in our geography have seen probably more than 40 bushel per acre yield increases over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
So
I agree. And a lot of times we talk about the difference in, this is a management talk. So genetics and management, there's arguments whether it's 70-30 or 60-40, but still, even if it's 30-40% coming from management, that's still a lot that comes from the grower side. So expectation of that in the future too, obviously. So
and it's the 30 or 40% the farmer can actually control.
Yes, yeah, because like anything, there's always the weather factor, and we can't cure that. So we're just agronomists. So the soybean side is a similar situation. This is probably more so the discussion on why do soybeans not yield as much as corn. We're not going to dive into that today, although I'd love that topic. It's been about a 10 bushel increase. It's about 42 to 52 bushel an acre. Once again, obviously this is USDA information, so national or nationwide trend lines. So still, 10 bushel an acre even in soybeans in the last 20 years is pretty impressive. So where is this coming from? That's what we're going to tackle today, and the management factors that play into that. So the first one we're going to start off with is planting date. This one, I have a graph here, a table that shows planting date trends and looking back 20 years ago. And I got both of them up there on the screen, but I kind of highlighted what I wanted everybody's attention to focus on, and that's really kind of that first part of May. So we tend to think about early planting in terms of corn, and everybody's like, oh, let's get the corn in the ground. But it does seem like it's been a trend that most people now are saying, well, they either have another planter for soybeans, so they're planting at the same time, or some of them are planting soybeans before corn.
Absolutely. So what are some factors, Phil? I 100% agree with your information here. No question that earlier planting has been one of the largest factors that have helped us increase soybean yields with management over the last 20 years. But what are some things that have allowed us to plant soybean earlier?
Yeah, that's
other management.
That's a great question, and one of those things in my mind, from what's probably been the biggest difference, is genetics. I got to go back to genetics again. Obviously, we've got a lot of great gains in genetics, so the ability of those beans to be able to tolerate early season diseases, early season stress, come out of the ground. Soybeans obviously once they're out of the ground can be frosted off, but we're seeing a lot of this increase coming from early planting, and there's discrepancies on it. I have some information here that most universities even will say upwards of a 10% yield increase coming from early planting. And there's other sources too that we have that maybe even more than that, which I would call ultra early, or they may refer to as ultra early planting situations, to get more nodes and so forth and more production before you hit that reproduction or the flowering time period. But the other thing that you're probably alluding to somewhat is the seed treatment side of things. That's one part of the seed industry that's really had a lot of gains. And I look back, as far as our information goes, started 20 years ago, about 5% of soybean seed was treated, and now we're about 60%. So I would say it's even higher in a lot of cases, especially for guys that are planting early.
Yeah. Yeah, and I tell you, planting date studies was part of my PhD research in soybean, and so I talked a lot about planting date. I talked so much about planting date, I'm tired of talking about it. But I will tell you, when I was giving presentations to farmer groups in graduate school, there were a lot of farmers that, oh, you know how much SDS those beans are going to get if you plant early? You can't plant beans in April. I mean, I just get beat up over it, Mm-hmm. And as time has went on, I think talking to growers now, seed treatments, particularly things like Alivo, have just given growers a lot more confidence that they can do that without taking a huge ding in yield.
Yeah.
So I think seed treatments have just give farmers a lot more confidence about planting soybean early. That's kind of my general perspective as I've talked to folks over the last 20 years.
Yeah, and since, that was so long ago that you did your PhD, right? Times have changed, but I do agree. It seems like it's only been in the last 10 years or so that's become more accepted. Mm-hmm. And the number of people that have beans treated, even if they're not planting early. Mm-hmm. It used to be a discussion of make sure you treat those early planted soybeans. Now it's, I'm going to treat pretty much all my soybeans, and hopefully I can get them planted as early as possible. And if I don't, then so what? They've still got early season protection on the fungal side of things for sure. But yeah, it seems like that's been a pretty stark change over the last 20 years now that they've done that.
And maybe you're not. Maybe you're going to get into this, Phil. And if you are, I apologize. I barely looked at your presentation. But the other thing I think about when I think about seed treatments itself is how much advancement's been made in seed treatment active ingredients over the last 20 years. I mean, when I was at DuPont Pioneer, we were looking at 30, 40 different AIs a year, and that was a long time ago, So just the advancements in seed treatment active ingredients themselves in the last 20 years has probably been astonishing. In other words, we're using a lot better AIs today than we were 20 years ago, I would guess. I would think so.
Yeah, I totally agree. And there's a lot of options out there, but I think that's the key, that we have a lot more options and a lot continually getting better in that area too. And I think the other thing is, and I can't remember the exact number, but I know some university research, I believe it was Iowa State, said that there's around a 20% stand reduction from planting early, and they still saw a yield benefit on the backside. So stand loss, and a lot of people are starting to come around to this. It's tough on the seed side. You got to walk the line. You don't want people planting so early that they end up in trouble. But on the soybean side, they can make up a lot of ground on the back end of the season. They're all about compensation. Like I said, we won't get into the weather aspect of things, but that loss in stand, and there's a lot of high yield guys out nowadays that are getting amazing yields with sub 100,000 stand at the end of the season. So,
yeah, Phil. In fact, you brought up the seedling loss with early planting. In my PhD work, we measured a bunch of that stuff. We had like 32 on-farm sites, and I forget exactly, but I think we lost 9% of stand with the early planting dates relative to the normal planting dates, but the early planting dates still yielded more. So, we lost 9%, but they still yielded, statistically more, I forget, 4 or 5 bushel, but more for sure. So, yeah.
Yeah, and when I did my master's degree, I know we had a plot in northern Indiana that we had that lost. It was down to 60,000 stand. And this is going back to like a judgment call at the beginning of the season on replants, but which won't go off into that tangent too far. But we had a stand of 60,000 and it still yielded 72 bushel at the end of the season. And that was on tougher, sandier soils. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, you can take a pretty good hit. I'm not encouraging everybody to plant 100% of their soybean acres early, but that trend has definitely been one of the major causes of yield increases that we've seen on soybeans for sure. And the next thing, like I just kind of mentioned, is the population trends, I'll call it, because corn and beans are a little bit different when it comes to this. So on the corn side, I have some figures here, and you can see there's about a 17%. Once again, this is using USDA figures. So on the top side, we have 2024, the 5-year average at 31,400. Most people are planting more than that, but like I said, this is showing the trend overall using surveys and so forth. So we've still seen 17% increase in planting populations. And this is, this goes into the fact that more plants per acre. That's the number one driver in terms of yield, plants per acre, seed per year, and kernel weight. It's hard to get past more ears per acre is going to get you higher yields. And I think that's what a lot of people are seeing. That's why that trend keeps going up. On the flip side of this, obviously, there's the discussion of what do you have at the end of the season. That's really what it comes down to, what's actually in the field. And university research will show as long as it's around 30, 31, 31.5, that it's going to have 100% yield potential. But in a lot of cases, some of these hybrids and these genetics that we have nowadays can tolerate that competition better. And so guys are pushing it, and they're seeing the results. Obviously, most people aren't going to spend as much money as seed is nowadays. They're not going to spend extra money if they don't have to. So I would say in our area that number would be, at least 4,000 probably per acre higher. But the trend is definitely going up in terms of corn. On the soybean side, it's kind of the reverse, the flip side. So 1997, I have 200,000 down to, this was actually the USDA information, down to 157 in 2018. So
Wow.
not quite,
So
not
in
quite.
In 1997, we were planting 200,000 seeds per acre on average.
That was the USDA,
Holy
yes.
smokes.
And
That's a huge change.
It is a huge change. It might be a little bit more than if we would bring it down to our geography. I bet it'd be a little bit smaller, but I still think you'd see that trend.
Oh yeah, you'd
Because
see that trend, yeah.
we've had a lot of changes. Well, equipment and so forth, I think, drove a lot of this. We had, especially 30, 40 years ago, a lot of soybeans were still planted in narrow rows, drilled and so forth. And it took those changes. Then we had no-till drills, and it kind of pushed some more of that narrow row spacing on. And then, especially in Iowa, you can see, I have a graph up here that shows the difference between seeding rate and row spacing. So seeding rates have gone down, and our row spacing has increased. And I think in a lot of cases, and you're probably well aware of the data in certain regions, but at least in Iowa, it seems that row spacing, we tend to see a 7% or so increase in narrow rows, but in Iowa, it doesn't always hold true. And I think
Right.
a lot of that comes from, disease pressure and so forth. And well, it's a lot easier to efficiency-wise for growers to be able to drive down the rows and stuff, which is nice. But in terms of the yield, on any given year, it seems like we may not necessarily see that yield increase from narrow rows in our latitude. And I think a lot of that comes from the disease challenges that we deal with.
Yeah, the row spacing thing isn't super clear, meaning that the 15-inch rows yield more than 30-inch rows. Mm-hmm. But what I've seen, the further you move north, the more true that tends to be. Yeah. So, what we know is that generally speaking, narrow rows tend to yield more than 30-inch rows, but not always, for sure.
Yeah. Like you said, it's a lot about light interception, closing that row.
And I'm sure there's an interaction with the yield environment. In other words, if you have very productive soils, you're going to get a lot more canopy coverage with 30-inch rows than you are 15-inch rows. And obviously the opposite would be true. In poor growing environments, you might need the 15-inch rows to maximize light interception by R3. I'm sure.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that information, but I bet that'd be the case. So, I think if you're a grower out there and you have very productive soils and that's all you farm, you're probably doing all right with 30-inch rows. But if you've got some heavy, not so productive hill ground or some challenging growing environments, my guess is you're probably better off with 15-inch rows.
Yeah.
That'd be my guess. At our latitude, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Okay, so before we jump into the next segment, which is fertility and looking at fertility trends and how they've changed, I just want to remind everybody that 20 years is 2004.
Yeah, in fact, Phil, that wasn't that long ago because I was a freshman in college in 2004.
I'm not going to date
Feels
myself,
like
but I'll... But yeah, it does. It seems like we're talking about something back in the 80s or 90s, but we're not. And so when you think about this and think about, we're going to talk about yield and yield goals and things like that. 20 years ago, it's not as long as it thinks. Unfortunately, time goes faster than we want to think. So I want to jump in this before we get started and talk about the genetic aspect of this before we get into the management side of that. And that's the changes in the genetics have come from this yield change. A lot of it has come from a couple things. And one of those is basically harvest index. We've seen about a 0.26% increase per year. So what does that mean? Well, essentially it means we have bigger plants with more biomass, more nutrients, and they're doing a better job getting it into the seed. So moral of the story, it's to not overcomplicate it. We have plants being more efficient. Now there's a lot of other aspects of that. We just talked about row spacing. So, their leaf architecture and things are all a part of this in this increase. But in general, over time, we've seen that more biomass, more dry matter ends up in the seed at a greater concentration with these modern hybrids and varieties. So
Yes.
they're doing a better job.
Yeah, so
putting it in
basically
seed.
we're just getting more of that plant to put the plant mass into the grain itself. That's
Exactly.
that's great.
Yeah, and more efficient, nutrients and everything. We won't dive too deep on that. But what I do want to get into is one of the things that's changed a lot. I think a lot of people have seen this is fertility recommendations over the last 20 years. It seems like every state university has updated this. I put the tri-state in here, which is from my home state of Ohio. But Iowa State has also changed theirs in the last couple of years
Illinois
here.
has changed theirs
In
in the last
Illinois,
couple of
yeah.
years.
So they're all updating it using modern varieties and hybrids and tracking how those hybrids and varieties do a better job at putting nutrients in the grain. So what does that mean essentially? Well, actually it tends to show that the removal isn't as much per bushel. But then why do we see a decrease on our soil tests? That's really the question. Well, we're getting higher yields.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I think a lot of times what happens, like I said, 20 years ago, 2004, a lot of times people don't use maybe the actual yield. And I know, unfortunately, this happens today too. We don't maybe use the correct yield. Even 20 years ago, especially, we're more yield goal focused. But if times are tough and things like that, we may not use yield. Say, oh, what's your removal? Well, you got 75 bushel, but you'd say what? 60 on soybeans?
Yeah, right.
It was a trend, especially back then. I'd still say it is a little bit now, but we tend to underestimate our removal rates or our yield that actually happen in the field. So using more of not looking at the actual realized yield, that we should be using to get the proper fertility rate for a field. So I have this chart up here, and it shows you how things have changed. On the bottom here, I put from 2004 to 2024, just a potassium removal here, and how that's changed from 1.4 pounds per bushel. Like I said, this is tri-state to 1.14 pounds per bushel. We won't get into why none of the universities can agree on, a standard number, but that's somewhat arbitrary. To me, it's more or less not using the realized yield that ends us up in this position of being low on P and K levels, and we've seen that with Liqui-Grow samples. I know you've shown this chart a few times, but this chart on potassium and showing where our soil tests are at in terms of levels and what percentage of them are low, and 50% of them
and
are low.
it's particularly the case with potassium, and I think there's a bunch of factors that have led to alarmingly low potassium levels in some cases. I think farmers don't realize just how much potassium soybeans are removing.
Mm-hmm.
Remove a lot of potassium. Number two, a little over 60% of the ground in Iowa anyway is cash rented. So you don't exactly get aggressive on fertility in a cash rent situation. Not always. And I think, to your point that you were making, we just, not only are soybean and corn, but soybean's the real bad culprit. We're removing so much potassium. Yields have just been higher than folks have anticipated over the last 20 years. And we've had some really good yields. It might, we've had some phenomenal yields. So it's soybeans remove a lot of K. It's a lot of cash rented acres, and yields have just been really high over the last 20 years. And so that's accumulated into falling potassium levels.
Yeah, and I didn't put this one as a trend, but I think even 20 years ago there was likely more people that fertilized for 2 years, and this goes to what you were just saying in terms of corn and bean yields. well, I'm going to fertilize for 200 bushel on corn and 50 bushel on soybeans, and then you pulled off 240 and 72 bushels, and you quickly end up in a deficit position in your soil. And potassium takes, quite a bit to build that level back up, and in Iowa, can be challenging on higher pH soils too.
Yep. So. There was just a survey done in the state of Illinois by the NREC group that I'm a member of, the Nutrient Research and Education Council. And that survey, large survey across the entire state, indicated that more farmers are now spreading fertilizer by crop versus a 2-year spread. And I think part of that is because you just aren't applying enough potassium to the soybeans when you give the soybeans what's left. There's been more focus on growing good soybeans, and farmers have realized that that's a very important part of the financial situation, is making sure those soybeans yield well. So I would say that's why we're trending toward doing more per year fertilizer applications than applying fertilizer to the corn and the soybeans get what's left.
Yep. I think, and probably a lot of the credit goes to that for agronomists and the folks out there in industry and extension alike, and that's a win for soybeans, because I hear a lot of that. Why don't my soybeans yield? Well, right there's a primary cause when they're treated as a second crop or the ugly stepsister or something. So I have to throw this in here because this to me, over the last 20 years, to me, I would say I've seen von Liebig's the barrel with the staves. I don't know, a lot of times. If I had a nickel for every time I've seen it, I'd definitely be rich. But that concept, I would say, pretty much shows 20 years ago what our mentality was in terms of fertility. It was all about one particular nutrient that might be limiting our production, whether it's NPK or a micro or whatever. It was only one nutrient, and that one nutrient, okay, now we need to add as much as we can of that. Maybe it's potassium, so we dump a bunch of potassium on to try and fix the problem. Well, unfortunately, that's not the way it works in soil fertility. And we've kind of come around to that. We're going to show one of the studies that you've done, and it's just not the case. And we know that, like with water and nitrogen, there's a lot of nutrients, especially that are co-limiting factors of one another. And whether it's in the plant or in the soil, they kind of work in tandem. So I threw the Mulder's chart in here because I think that's becoming a little more of our mentality in 2024, that, hey, all these nutrients interact with each other. So dumping a bunch of one on is not necessarily a good thing. And so this is a good change, obviously, a change that over the last 20 years has been a big improvement, in my opinion. We're starting to understand, starting to fertilize for it, and starting to understand how this interaction.
And to be honest, Phil, the truth is soil fertility is hard. It's hard because every soil chemically is different. These interactions are a little different in every soil and every geography. But the good news is we're doing a lot of fertility research to help understand how those nutrients interact with one another and how to help folks maximize their efficiency, profitability, and yield. So we're doing a lot of thinking about soil fertility, but it's challenging.
Like you said, that's a good thing. But it's not predictable. It's not predictable, and it's not something we can always say, oh, you put this much on and you'll get this much out. It's just not the way it works. There's so much else going on in the soil. So this is our balanced nutrition study. I think this helps us understand why, some of these co-limiting or, these nutrients that go together and build each other up are synergistic. You've talked a lot about nitrogen and phosphorus. One of the ones we probably early on knew. I'd say in the last 20 years, nitrogen and sulfur might be in that category now, since we've lost a lot of sulfur deposition, from cleaning up our coal power plants and such. Some of that has been lost, and we've just understood better that nitrogen and sulfur, go together, and especially when it comes to corn, but even in soybeans. And
you may not know it, Phil, but next year, I'm pretty sure we're going to end up cooperating with a large university study that's going to be established all over the upper Midwest, looking at nitrogen and sulfur interactions. So there's a lot of indication that nitrogen and sulfur ratios could be important to maximizing the efficiency of the nutrients and yield. So, we were at the North Central meetings. You heard them talk a little bit, and I've been kind of working in the background here, talking with some of those guys, following up, and we're going to start looking at nitrogen sulfur interactions going forward. So we're always working on this, and to your point, making sure that all these nutrients are where they need to be is very important to maximizing yield and efficiency.
So inside sneak peek of what we're doing in 2025. News to even me. No. Okay, so now we're going to finish up with the top 5 things that I feel have changed in the last 20 years on fertility. So number 1 is nitrogen rates right off the bat. And this we could get into a whole long topic, but we're not going to go too far. But 20 years ago, it was more about yield goals, than it was. Then we kind of got into environmental and other things. We ended up in the MRTN, economic all these things, a lot of nitrogen calculators and lots of different things that, we're still a little bit in that phase, but we've definitely gotten much better with a lot of on-farm trials. Even universities developing statewide trials, really zeroed in nitrogen rates on specific soil types. So in my opinion, that has changed a lot in the last 20 years, is nitrogen rates on corn.
Well, interestingly, Phil, so you bring that up, in that large survey that I was just made privy to 2 days ago, so you used the term MRNT, which is the maximum return to nitrogen, and that was a calculator was originally developed by University of Illinois, just saying.
Don't brag
and
too
then,
much.
And then Iowa State picked it up, and a lot of the Midwestern universities picked it up. And, that would be, if you were to ask your extension agent, how much in should I put on my corn, they would tell you, look at the MRNT calculator. We're not going to get into all about what that is and so on and so forth. And I've made videos talking about that in detail. But turns out that in the survey, growers don't know exactly what the MRNT calculator is, but they're applying pretty much what the MRNT calculator says to apply. So I think what that means is that information has penetrated agronomists and farmers and advisors, and people are getting the word out that maybe we shouldn't be using yield-based in-rate recommendations anymore, and we should be using economics of the price of nitrogen, the price of corn, and historical observations. So, yeah.
And there's other detriments to adding just more nitrogen. I think we've
started
started really
absolutely.
Understand that. So the next thing was nitrogen placement and timing. A lot of this is nitrogen, but a lot of it has to do with nitrogen, especially in corn. And so timing, split applications. This is one I'd say sometimes equipment somewhat drives some trends, especially in tillage and so forth. There's a lot of equipment out there in terms of timing Y drops. It seems like now that they have side dress machines that have Y drops and a coulter, and just a lot of options for that. But in the last 20 years, I'd say in a lot of cases we've gone to more split applications, which is good. Better nutrient or nitrogen use efficiency by getting it closer to.
Phil, even in the last 10 years since I've been here, we have a lot more high clearance equipment that is capable of doing nitrogen applications after V5, V6. So in years and instances in soils where we know we need to be side dressing, even our organization has geared up to meet the needs of the farmer. So I would say that the equipment, the mentality, the need to be able to help the customers has changed a lot, even in the last 10 years.
Yep. Number 3 is probably a hot button for both of us, but it'd be sulfur when it comes to fertilizing corn and beans. And sulfur use, I'd say for both of those, obviously I mentioned the loss of sulfur deposition, but even just the general better understanding of how sulfur and nitrogen work together and how much both crops need in terms of sulfur. And I think that's soybeans especially, we've seen they do require quite a bit of sulfur, and the mineralization up front early in the season, kind of like nitrogen, is not happening at that high rate. So
and with earlier planting, we're planting soybeans earlier for sure. The soil, it takes a long time for soil to mineralize sulfur, even longer than nitrogen. And so we're starting to produce yield and determine yield today sooner than that sulfur mineralization is happening. So having a sulfur fertilizer source there and available whenever the crop starts to need it, I think is another important management, genetics by management, interaction that it's genetic because we've been able to plant earlier because of genetics, and it's management because we now are seeing that we need sulfur with those earlier planted soybeans.
Yeah, exactly. Fourth one I have is a micronutrient use, and this one we could go down a long string, but I'm just going to kind of mention it. It's definitely increased over the last 20 years. There's quite a bit of information on the lack of micros out there, and I think a lot of this goes back to our high yields that we're seeing. We're continuing to see higher yields, and we're continuing to draw down on some of those levels that we thought, 20 years ago. I feel like the mantra was, you'll never need to fertilize for micronutrients. When I was in university and extension, not saying it's a bad thing, but that was kind of where we were at.
Well, I'm going to use zinc for example. When I was getting my PhD, we did a little bit of micronutrient work, a little bit, but the mantra from the universities and extension was, you don't need zinc. I tell you what, that's been one of the more consistent yielding nutrients that I've looked at here at Liqui-Grow. So I would definitely say when it comes to zinc, corn definitely on a lot of acres needs zinc. Your local Liqui-Grow agronomy field advisor for more information on, do or don't you need zinc, but just generally speaking, I've had tremendous yield increases to zinc in my plot work anyway.
Yeah.
Much more than I ever would have anticipated.
And that's definitely the one at the top. Zinc, even since 20 years ago, has been at the top, but much higher use now. So the last one I'm going to mention is biostimulants, biologicals.
Oh, we could have a whole week session on this. Holy smokes, my head's spinning, Phil. Even say biologicals, my head starts spinning.
I don't want to go down the rabbit hole too far on this one, but obviously, we're looking into it. You're looking into it hard. Our research is focusing heavily on it too, and it's just a hot topic nowadays. I'm not saying it's a trend or a fad, but growers want to understand how to better use, not only their nutrients and their fertilizer, but they're trying to look out for their soil. And I think that's some of that mentality is starting to change, and that's where we're getting some of these things to work in here, because they want to be able to make the best use of, fertilizer efficiency and getting it into their crop.
In another 20 years, I'm guessing when we do this again in 20 more years, Phil, we're probably going to look back and say, biologicals was a huge advancement over the last 20 years. And there's a lot of money being poured into biologicals. We're trying to wade through all that right now. But I'm thinking they're going to make an impact in the next 20 years in some way, shape, or form. Figuring that out is what we're in the midst of right now.
Yeah. Yep. So that wraps up my look back at 20 years of management and how things have changed. Like I said, we took you down, still got the genetics, the environment, not the environment, but the management, leaving the environment out, although we talked about it, because those always go together. But when it comes to management, it's all about planning, in my opinion, and from the farmer perspective, and that's why these things have changed, because farmers have gotten better, more strategic. They're using their advisors to them and getting better at managing a lot of these things, and that's where these trends come from, to see higher yield increases. So with that, we thank you for watching this Lead Academy video, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Yeah, thank you very much. Have a great day.
Lead Academy.
Liqui-Grow
Excellent
And agronomy
development.